Today, we're going to talk a little bit about images that relate to the Easter story, a number of images and the artists that produced them. This has been a subject, of course, that has been dealt with by artists for centuries. And when we talk about the Easter story, normally what we're talking about, to a large extent, are those events that comprise what we call the Passion of Christ. So the Passion normally begins in terms of its chronology with Palm Sunday, which is Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and then it normally ends with his crucifixion and death. The resurrection is often part of the Passion as well. So we're going to have a little excursion through the way artists in the Western tradition have dealt with this subject. And before we even get into some of the visual elements of the talk, I want to just mention a couple of other places where this discussion has and the images of the Passion have been dealt with. The story of the Passion is so profound and so moving that it has not just been relegated to depictions in the visual arts, but of course it has been profoundly dealt with in music, and most especially in two pieces of music that are illustrated for you on the screen here in the left and in the center. And these are the Passions written by Johann Sebastian Bach. So the St. John Passion on the left, which in fact that cover of that score is using our own painting here from the National Gallery, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. And then, of course, the St. Matthew Passion. In many ways, these are the most profound investigations and explications of the Passion story. In my estimation, they are without a doubt. So if you're not familiar with these two Passions, the St. John Passion, the St. Matthew Passion, you might want to listen to some excerpts. I will be coming back to mention a few things about Bach and these Passions and later in the talk. The St. John Passion was premiered in 1724, the St. Matthew Passion in 1727. So that's the realm of music. Then on the far right, I'm showing you a poster, and it pertains to a film. And this is a film by the Italian director Pier Paolo Pasolini, and it's The Gospel According to Matthew, and it was a film that premiered in 1964. There have been many filmed versions of this story, going back to the silent days of film, to Cecil B. DeMille, to more recently Mel Gibson. So you can find numerous interpretations of this story through cinema. But in my estimation, the Pasolini film is the greatest film ever made on this topic. And interestingly enough, that was also the opinion of the Vatican. When this film came out, the Vatican said that it was the best film on Christ ever made, which is particularly interesting when you consider that Pasolini was a gay, atheist, Marxist, and that for the most part the church hated everything else that he ever made and censored his films often. But this film they loved. And this is a real achievement, cinematic achievement. So if you haven't seen this film, I would suggest that you take a look at that as well. But we're going to be concerned with painting and sculpture when we explore this subject. And as a kind of chronological signpost, I'm going to be using images that come from this particular portfolio that's illustrated on the screen now. I'm showing you two woodcuts by the German artist Albrecht Dürer. And these are two woodcuts that come from a large portfolio. It was 36 woodcuts plus a cover page that dealt with the Passion of Christ. He called this one the Small Passion, or we call it the Small Passion, because he did another portfolio in which the images were larger in scale. So this one is referred to as the Small Passion. There are 36 images, which means that Dürer included a number of subjects that we don't normally consider to be part of the Passion. He even had Old Testament subjects and things of that nature. But I've picked out the images that pertain more specifically to what we'll be discussing, and we'll be sort of tracking the story through these woodcuts. So on the left is Dürer's woodcut of Christ's entry into Jerusalem. This whole series dates to 1509 to 1510, so all of the woodcuts that I'll show you are the same date, 1509 to 1510. And then on the right is Christ expelling the moneylenders from the temple. Now, well, let's start with some scripture. So the subject that normally begins the Passion is, in fact, this scene on the left when Christ enters Jerusalem. It's told in all of the Gospels, but I'm going to just read you a passage from John 12 to 16, and it says, "On the next day, much people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went forth to meet him and cried, Hosanna! Blessed is the King of Israel that cometh in the name of the Lord. And Jesus, when he had found the young ass, sat thereon, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, thy king cometh sitting on an ass's colt. These things understood not his disciples at the first, but when Jesus was glorified, then remembered they that these things were written of him, and that they had done these things unto him." There's a couple of things here. First of all, the scriptural references I'll be reading today come from the King James Version of the Bible, so that's the source I'm using. And inherent in this passage right here, where it says that as it had been written, what we have here very often, just as we had in the Christmas story, we have very often a typology, which is to say that very often images of the New Testament were linked with images and prophecies of the Old Testament. So this linkage of trying to link the Old and the New Testament is particularly important, and we'll see that sort of play out in a number of ways as we go through and look at the images today. Now, Christ driving out the money changers or cleansing the temple, is one of the first acts that Jesus partakes of after he enters Jerusalem. This is Durer's interpretation on the right. We do have a wonderful painting, though, in our collection, and it's this one by El Greco of Christ cleansing the temple, a painting that dates to probably just before 1570. Let's read that passage so we can understand what artists were reading themselves, the sources they were using. Again, I'm picking and choosing various Gospels. In this case, I'm reading from Mark 11, 15 to 19. "And they come to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? But ye have made it a den of thieves. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people was astonished at his doctrine." So that's the way it's related in Mark. And that's, again, the source that the artists are looking at very often. It's interesting, of course, because in that passage it refers to the fear that the authorities have now about this sort of revolutionary, rebellious individual who's causing this trouble. And that in the Pasolini film that I just mentioned, Pasolini sees Jesus in that particular way. He sees him as a revolutionary. And of course, because he was a Marxist, that sort of fit in nicely with his own philosophy. But this is very common, this idea that Jesus was really a threat and was a revolutionary figure in that sense. And that plays out in the cleansing of the temple. El Greco is a fascinating and important painter. He's Greek by birth. He's born in Crete. But of course, most of his career takes place in Spain. But between Crete and Spain, when he was traveling from Greece to Spain, he stayed and stopped in Venice, in Italy. This painting was painted in Venice when he was there. We currently have a wonderful exhibition up on Tintoretto, and indeed, this painting by El Greco is directly indebted to the Venetian mannerists like Veronese and especially Tintoretto. So if you haven't seen the Tintoretto show yet, I would advise you to make some time to see it. It's up until July. So here, everything about this painting speaks of really of Veronese and Tintoretto, the drama, the full body figures, the action, the strong diagonal, this sort of strange, ambiguous space. It recedes dramatically on the right, and then you have all the figures kind of pushed over to the left. There's a kind of dishevelment and cacophony. Things are being spilled and tipped over. And that kind of energy and action is very typical of Tintoretto, and it's something that El Greco greatly admired. Not only that, but technically, in terms of how the paint is applied here, it's loose, it's very pictorial, very painterly. You see the brush strokes. There's a great sense of energy in the actual technique that's employed. So for this subject, a subject that requires action and drama, Christ coming into this temple and tipping over all the tables and sort of making everybody scurry, this is a perfect example of the energy. But in the case of El Greco, he's greatly indebted really to the Venetians. So Christ's entry into Jerusalem, among the first things that happens is he goes to the temple and finds this situation and he cleanses the temple. And if we try to stay again with a kind of rough chronology of the Passion, we come to a subject like this on the left. This is a very unassuming painting. It's small. I would venture to say few people even notice it when they're walking through the galleries. But it does represent the next sort of event in some ways of the Passion. This is a painting by an Italian painter, a Lombard painter, painting in the north, especially around Brescia. Vincenzo Civerchio is his name, and it's Christ instructing Peter and John to prepare for the Passover. So that's the subject. Christ instructing Peter and John to prepare for the Passover. This painting dates to 1504. Now, this is not an often represented scene in the Passion, and that's because it's pretty boring. Essentially, what you have going on here is one guy telling a bunch of other guys to go find a place to eat. And so, unlike what we just saw, the cleansing of the temple, which is all drama and activity and chaos, this is a pretty quiet subject. That's not to say it hasn't been represented by other artists. So I'm showing you on the right illuminated manuscript. It's called the Vaux Passional, Vaux, V-A-U-X. And it shows Peter and John sent to prepare the Passover. It's exactly contemporary with the painting. It's 1503 to 1504. It's today in the National Library of Wales. It's an English manuscript. And in fact, it was compiled and created as a gift for Henry VII following the death of his wife in February of 1503. So let's read the appropriate passage again. This time I'm going to go to Luke 22, 7 to 13. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare? And he said unto them, Behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. And ye shall say unto the good man of the house, The master saith unto thee, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he shall show you a large upper room furnished. There make ready. So that's the passage in Luke. Now in our painting, you just see the initial sort of statement of Jesus or request of Jesus to the apostles, go and find the place for the Passover. But in the illuminated manuscript, you have a little bit of a sequential narrative. So you have that event that's in our painting here, where Jesus is speaking to the apostles to tell them what they need to do. They exit here, so they're the next step in the story. They're leaving. Then they're down on the road. That's the third step. And then just as Jesus says, you'll find a man bearing a pitcher of water. That's up here. So in the illuminated manuscript, there is actually a temporal unfolding of the event in terms of the various moments in the story. Once the place of the Passover is found, of course, then we come to the story that certainly everybody knows in one way or another, and probably everybody has seen a version of this, and that's the Last Supper. So here on the left is Durer's portrayal from the Small Passion series of the Last Supper. And again, remember the dates here are 1509, 1510. It's a woodcut. And then on the right, a subject associated with that event or that moment is Christ washing the feet of the disciples. So reading first the text about the Last Supper, and in this case I've chosen Matthew 26, 20 to 25. And we read, "Now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12, and as they did eat, he said, Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. And they were exceeding sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, Lord, is it I? And he answered and said, He that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. The Son of Man goeth as it is written of him, but woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, which betrayed him, answered and said, Master, is it I? He said unto him, Thou hast said." So that's the moment. And then, of course, Judas leaves, and we have the celebration of the Eucharist, in essence, the first Mass, which is what the Last Supper represents. Now, after that event is the Christ washing the feet of his disciples. We do have a small painting of that in our collection. It's this painting here. This is by an artist from Ferrara named Garofalo, and it dates to about 1520. So what's going on here? Well, again, you can find this in different Gospels, but I've chosen John 13, 4 to 5, and then drop down to 13 through 17. He, Jesus, riseth from supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself. After that he poureth water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Ye call me Master and Lord, and ye say well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that ye should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If ye know these things, happy are ye if ye do them." So that's this moment where Jesus, in a sense, humbles himself to show his support and loyalty and devotion to his disciples. Now, this is a painting from 1520, and that's interesting because 1520 is the year that Raphael dies. Leonardo dies in 1519. And with the death of Raphael especially, we sort of say that the High Renaissance comes to an end. But already in this painting, there are a lot of formal aspects that speak to what we talk about in the sort of aftermath of the High Renaissance, what we call mannerism, where artists begin to distort and rely less on looking at nature and more on technique. So in Venetian painting, certainly Veronese, Tintoretto, those certainly would be considered mannerist painters, and certainly Garofalo. So when you look at these images and body types, look at this guy here. That's pretty tough, unless you're double jointed, to have your head and upper torso this way and your waist that way and then your leg this way. In other words, this is typical of mannerism. There's a kind of anatomical distortion, often an elongation. It's done for rather expressive purposes, but it's a breaking down of the High Renaissance canon that had reached perfection really in the art of Raphael. A lot of these figures actually, Garofalo is thinking of Raphael, but he's pushing the ideas much farther in terms of how he sees the story and the figure types. This is Judas, who has his money bag already on his belt here. And you'll notice Judas's face is darker than the rest of the apostles, and that's very typical. Judas's face is often swarthier, darker than his colleagues, given his role as the one who will betray Jesus. Now, the Last Supper is one of the most often represented subjects in the Passion. I'm sure you all know the Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper. We have an interpretation of it here at the gallery. It's this one. This is by a Venetian painter, Sebastiano Ricci. It's The Last Supper, dates to about 1713, so it's an 18th century picture. But even though it's 18th century, it's Venetian, 18th century, what you have here is Ricci still thinking back, in fact, to Tintoretto. So in the current exhibition that we have up right now, there is a Last Supper painting by Tintoretto that you will want to look at, and there's a very famous one that's still in Venice. And what's interesting about Ricci here is that he still is taking elements from Tintoretto, the kind of confusion and cacophony. People are doing many different things. They're leaning down to get more wine. They're talking to each other. There are servants at the table. This is Judas again, who's leaving, has his money bag. So he's separate from the rest of the apostles. But even though this is a small scale painting, it's nowhere near as big as Tintoretto paintings. It captures the same kind of, you almost would say, confusion, where you have to look carefully to figure out who is who and what are they doing. And sometimes you're not even sure that you're looking at a Last Supper, because sometimes Christ is so embedded amidst all this other activity that he's hard to actually locate. So this is an example of the Last Supper here at the gallery. Now, after the supper is concluded, of course, Jesus goes off to pray. And this takes us to the so-called agony in the garden, or Christ on the Mount of Olives, as it's sometimes referred to. So here on the left is Durer's portrayal of Christ on the Mount of Olives. And then within that time in the garden, when Jesus is praying, is when he's going to be betrayed by Judas, and then the soldiers and the various forces aligned against him will come and take him captive, and that's what we have on the right. This is the betrayal of Christ, or Christ taken captive, also by Durer. Okay, so this is from Matthew 26, 36 to 46. Then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and saith unto the disciples, Sit ye here, while I go and pray yonder. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then saith he unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And he went a little further, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup, it's the dramatic pause, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And he cometh unto the disciples, and findeth them asleep, and saith unto Peter, What, could ye not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again the second time, and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them and went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then cometh he to his disciples, and saith unto them, Sleep on now, and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. And this is the moment when Judas enters with the soldiers and points out Jesus by going up to him and kissing him. So that's what we have going on here, this kiss. Now, in different gospel discussions of this moment, there is also this reference to a disciple, and in one gospel it's Peter, who then slices off the ear of Malchus. Malchus was a servant for the high priest, for Caiaphas. And that's often included in this moment where you see the betrayal by the kiss, and then Peter reacting strongly to the threat to Jesus by cutting off the ear of Malchus. Now, there are different versions of this. In Luke, it's actually, when that happens, Jesus actually takes the ear and through a miracle, repairs it. And that's considered the last miracle of Jesus before the resurrection. So there are different interpretations of that particular moment. Now, in the history of art, this betrayal, the kiss of Judas, has been one of the most often represented subjects because it is so perfectly dramatic. It's a dramatic moment, and it's relayed in the Gospels with such a sense of drama. We have this little medal on the left in our collection. It's by Valerio Belli, B-E-L-L-I, Valerio Belli, The Betrayal of Christ from 1525. In my estimation, this is just my personal opinion, the greatest interpretation of this particular subject is the one you're looking at on the right. And this is the painting by Giotto that's in the Arena Chapel, or the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. This is a fresco from about 1304. When an artist reads a source, he has all kinds of options in terms of how he might choose to portray the events of that passage, that literary passage. And in the case of Giotto, there is such a concentrated focus and energy on what is, of course, the most important part here, and that is Jesus' confrontation with Judas and this kiss, and that is at the heart of this painting. But you can handle it in different ways, and what Giotto does is to have Judas bring up his yellow cloak and bring it up around the shoulder of Jesus. And then you see their two heads, and what it in fact looks like is that we have two heads emerging from one body, from one stalk, you might say. Their faces are very different. Jesus is totally placid, at ease. He knows this is supposed to happen. Judas's face is already turning into a more, what shall we say, a cruder kind of face in terms of the details that his face has. And this motif of the cloak coming over the shoulder of Jesus so that it looks like you have two heads from one stalk is a perfect visual way of expressing the fact that these two men need each other. Jesus needs to be betrayed, and Judas is the guy who's going to betray him, so they need each other. And that sense of the fact that this has to happen, this is ordained, is very beautifully sort of encapsulated in that pose. You'll notice how all of the staffs and torches point down, almost like arrows, to this central part of the fresco. To the side is Peter cutting off the ear of Malchus here, as we see. So this is probably the most potent, in my estimation, the most potent interpretation of that moment in at least in the history of painting. Now, Christ goes through a series of trials or judgments where nobody really knows what to do with him, so they send him to different people to be judged. And on the left is Albrecht Dürer's image of Christ before Annas, A-N-N-A-S, Annas. Annas was, in fact, the high priest of Judea for about 10 years, from 6 to 15 A.D. But in the scripture, in the Gospels, it's only John who says that Jesus was taken to Annas. That's not referenced in the other three canonical Gospels. So it's not a scene that's that often represented, but in this case, Dürer does represent it. More commonly is the scene on the right, which is Christ before Caiaphas. And that's the more common moment. And in that discussion between Jesus and Caiaphas, in questioning Jesus, accuses him of blasphemy. And once that happens, then as he hears what he considers to be these blasphemous words, he rends his garment. He tears his garment, pulls the garment, and that's what you see happening here. So this is a particularly important, oft-represented confrontation. So we have, in differing ways, sometimes Christ before Annas, Christ before Caiaphas, Christ before Pilate, and Christ before Herod, because he's being shuttled back and forth during this sort of period when they're trying to figure out, the authorities are trying to figure out what exactly to do with him. Now, there's another story here that takes place when he's being confronted and judged by Caiaphas. And it is a very, very, very important visual, oft-represented visual moment by artists. It's interesting because it's a moment in the Passion story where Jesus is not even in the image. He's not a figure in this event, but it's what's taking place outside in the courtyard when Jesus is in front of Caiaphas. And of course, what this relates to is Peter. When Jesus is being questioned, Peter has followed Jesus after his arrest, but he's kept his distance for safety. He doesn't want to be seen as perhaps he's part of this conspiracy, shall we say. So Jesus is taken to Caiaphas, and then Peter is out in the courtyard, and there are a number of people there. There's a fire that's been lit to warm themselves. And it's at this time that Peter is questioned about whether or not, aren't you one of the followers of Jesus? These questions. Now, I'm showing you a painting on the right. It's not at the National Gallery, unfortunately. It's at the Met, New York. This is The Denial of St. Peter by Caravaggio from 1610. And then I'm showing you a little excerpt of the score from Bach's St. John Passion on the left, which I'm going to come back to and sort of analyze for you in a second. But The Denial of St. Peter by Caravaggio is one of, there are dozens and dozens of famous, important paintings of this subject by almost every important Western artist you can think of. I've just selected Caravaggio as one of the most important. This is one of Caravaggio's final paintings, painted in the final months of his life. So the typical cast here, although it can change because there are different moments, is we have Peter to the far right. He's sort of haggard, he's bald, his eyes are actually sort of rimmed with tears if you look closely. And then we have the guard on the far left of the painting. He's the guard for the high priest of Caiaphas. And then you have the woman in the center, who is the maid, and she's one of the high priest's maid, and she's the one who's actually questioning Peter. Aren't you one of the followers of Jesus? And Peter is making this sort of universal declaration by having his hands up to his chest, saying, in essence, you've got the wrong man. You mean me? No, it's not me. I don't know this man at all. Now, this, for painters, and especially for composers, and especially for Bach, this is the linchpin of the entire Passion. This moment when Peter denies Christ and then realizes that he has done so and goes out and weeps, and in the case of Bach, it says he wept bitterly, which is from Matthew, and it's actually in John Gospel as well. This is seen as a pivotal moment in this story because it's this moment in the story when we most identify with Peter. Peter is us, really. And he represents frailty, human frailty, but also human faith, and the search then for redemption as well. So let me take you through that sequence in the Gospels, and I'm going to stay with Matthew. And this is Matthew 26, 20 to 22. Now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12, and as they did eat, he said, Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. And they were exceeding sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, Lord, is it I? So that's the moment at the Last Supper that we've already talked about. Then we drop down a bit to verses 33 to 35, and Peter says, Peter answered and said unto him, Though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet I will never be offended. Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, that this night before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. Peter said unto him, Though I should die with thee, yet will I not deny thee. Likewise also said all the disciples. Then we go a little bit further down. Now Peter sat, this is when Jesus is being questioned and Peter is out in the courtyard. Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel came unto him, saying, Thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him, and said unto them that were there, This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, Surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech betrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now, in German, in the St. John Passion and in the St. Matthew Passion, bitterly is bitterlich. It's the word that you see at the end here. But what's interesting in both passions, the John Passion and the Matthew Passion, is that Bach understands that this is a pivotal moment, and he has in the score, this is a blow-up of the score of that moment, when we get to this passage here at the end, he writes it in a melismatic form. A melisma is when a composer uses a succession of notes but stays on one syllable. So you're singing just one syllable, but you're following a succession of notes. And that's exactly what's happening here, especially. And it's on the word bitterlich, bitterly. And what it sounds like, if you go and seek this out and listen to it, this is the St. John Passion, but he does the same thing in the St. Matthew Passion. As these notes descend, it sounds like weeping. The music is crying. The music is weeping. It's a brilliant, brilliant passage in Bach. He does this both in the St. John Passion, which you're looking at here, and he does it also in the St. Matthew Passion. Now, in the St. Matthew Passion, after this, the evangelist says that he went out and wept bitterly. In both cases, there's an aria that is then a kind of contemplation of what we've just heard. In the case of the St. John Passion, the aria talks about, it says, Ah, my soul, where will you go? Where shall I find relief? Should I stay here, or should I wish that hills and mountains were behind me? In the world there is no help, and in my heart are the pains of my wrongdoing, since the servant has denied the Lord. So that's the passage, the aria in the St. John Passion after this period where Peter is weeping. In the St. Matthew Passion is probably, arguably, the most famous aria in all of the Passions, and in one of the most famous in Western music. And it has this violin obbligato that's accompanying the text. And this is the aria known as Erbarme dich. And it says simply, Have mercy, my God, for the sake of my tears. See here before you, heart and eyes weep bitterly. Have mercy, my God. This aria is considered one of the most beautiful in Western music. This violin part that accompanies it, the violinist Yehudi Menuhin said, quote, it was the most beautiful piece of music ever written for the violin. And others see it clearly as the sort of pivotal moment in the Passion story, both in the St. John Passion as well as in the St. Matthew Passion. So artists have been attracted to that story of the denial of Peter, and in an inordinate number of cases where you see some of the great paintings of Western art. Now, once we get through the trial, and it's decided, of course, that Jesus will ultimately be crucified, I'm going to now just move on and look at a few other paintings. This is a triptych that we have at the gallery. It's by a Sienese painter in the 1380s, and it's scenes from the Passion of Christ. And then there are three from left to right. And the left is the agony in the garden, which we just talked about. And the center, obviously, is the crucifixion. And on the right is the descent into limbo. This was a painting that was in the Corcoran collection, and now we have inherited it. And it is a great addition to our Italian collection. So here we have the agony in the garden. And let's go ahead and look at a couple of details here. On the left is the agony in the garden, which we've already talked about, and I showed you Durr's interpretation. So again, it's a sequential kind of thing. Jesus is asking the disciples to come with him and stay with him, but they fall asleep. He prays by himself. And back here are the forces led by Judas who are coming now to betray Jesus. So they're kind of coming down this road in order to arrest him. The scene on the right is a scene of limbo, the descent into limbo. Now, limbo is a distinctly Catholic doctrine, and the moment I'm gonna sort of pass over this because we're going to come back to it in a few minutes. But let's look at the crucifixion a little more closely here, because in the crucifixion there are a number of scriptural accounts of different activities at the crucifixion. We have one thing going on here. Mary is swooning. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, is fainting from grief here, being attended to by John and Mary Magdalene. We have the two thieves in this interpretation of the painting. This is the good thief who's going to find salvation. These are angels here. This is the bad thief, and you can see this devil figure above him. We have down here in the corner the casting of lots for the raiment of Jesus, the soldiers who cast dice for who's going to get his cloak. That's down here. And then we have an image right here that you don't often see, but it is definitely scriptural, and that is the breaking of the legs of the thieves, in this case of the bad thief. This guy's got a big club, and he's breaking his legs. Now, this painting is very representative in Italian painting of the 14th and 15th centuries of this desire to really historicize biblical narrative, to really try to be accurate. So to show you every little detail that possibly can be extracted from the story. So there are a number of things. If you look closely at this painting in the gallery, you'll see droplets of blood that are pouring from Jesus' face as he prays. That's in the scripture. The smashing of the bad thief's legs, that's in the painting here. There are a lot of details so that the artist is trying to convey realism and that he knows the story and is trying to tell a story. This painting is a Sienese painting. It owes a lot to earlier Sienese painters, Simone Martini, the Lorenzetti brothers. But it also has almost a miniaturist quality about it, somebody who'd looked at illuminated manuscripts and small-scale works, because it has an incredibly detailed and very, very finished kind of approach. Now, I want to talk about that figure breaking the legs of the bad thief. This is, of course, in Scripture, and it's in John 19:31-36, and it reads, "Since it was the day of preparation, in order to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows what he tells, that he tells the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not a bone of him shall be broken." That was the prophecy. That not a bone of him shall be broken, and that ends up what happens here. Now, there are two things that happen there's another thing that happens to Jesus, and that is his side is pierced, right, by the spear of Longinus. And that also was seen as a typology, that had been foretold in Zechariah, in the Old Testament of Zechariah 12:10, where we read, "And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one who is in bitterness for his firstborn." So it says right here, "They shall look upon me whom they have pierced." So that was seen as a foretelling of Jesus being pierced while he's on the cross. And this is the figure of Longinus that we're going to now come to in a second. So the Andrea di Vanni, I'm not sure I even told you his name, Andrea di Vanni triptych is wonderful, but we have another very important work that tells this story and several moments in the story of the Passion, and it's this predella. I'm showing it to you in the bottom framed, and then on top without the frame. And this is by another Sienese painter, Benvenuto di Giovanni is his name, and it dates probably to 1491, and it has 5 different scenes across the predella. Christ, first the agony in the garden, then Christ carrying the cross, the crucifixion, the descent into limbo. We're going to come back to that. We just saw that with Andrea di Vanni, and then the resurrection on the far right. Now, this is a predella, and what that simply means is this was the part of an altarpiece that would have been placed at the bottom. It's long and narrow, and the major painting would have been above this, so this would have been down below. And in predella paintings, that's when artists very often try to have a strong narrative thrust. In the predella paintings, they can tell stories that relate to whatever the subject is that's above it. Now today, the painting that goes above our predella, we know where it is, and it's in Siena, and here it is. It's in the Pinacoteca Nazionale in Siena. So above our predella was this picture that you can see today in Siena, and it was the Ascension of Christ. So this is the way they went together. And here I've reconstructed it for you on the left. I've put our predella where it would have been under the large picture. That's the museum in Siena today on the right where this painting is housed. Now, if we go through the predella panels, we've already seen this story on the left, which is the agony in the garden. So this is Benvenuto di Giovanni's interpretation. We saw Durer's interpretation. We saw Andrea di Vanni's interpretation. This idea of if this cup can pass, if I don't have to take on this charge, and here's the angel bringing the cup to Jesus. Jesus told most of the apostles to stay in the back, and then he took the 3 here who are, again, sound asleep here. We haven't seen the subject on the right yet, and this is Christ carrying the cross. This is in all 4 of the canonical Gospels, and I'll read you one passage. This is from Luke 23, 26 to 31. And as they led him away, they laid hold upon one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross, that he might bear it after Jesus. And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which all bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus turned unto them and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming, in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? So actually what Jesus is saying here is, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves. Because if they will do this to me, I'm the green tree, imagine what's going to happen to you. So that's the passage in Luke. Now here we have Christ carrying the cross. He's being stoned. He's being dragged and pulled by the neck. We have these young boys here in the upper right. That's interesting because they've climbed this tree in order to see this procession, get a better look at this procession. That's interesting because it actually is a parallel motif to when Christ enters Jerusalem. And these young children try to climb trees so that they can get a better look at the procession into Jerusalem. This whole predella is so indebted to illuminated manuscripts and small, precious paintings because the colors, first of all, are so beautifully rich and saturated. They're jewel-like. The figures themselves are thin, spindly. They look very Gothic in their orientation. There's a tremendous element of fantasy in the way he paints this scene. He's on the ground. There are all of these they look like rocks, but when you look more closely, they look like gemstones. They're all different colors, broken glass or gem-like stones. And then there's just passages of pure fantasy like this soldier here. That's no armor that anybody is wearing at any time. And that is just a pure fantasy by Benvenuto to create something that is so delightfully, sort of visually rich and sumptuous. And then there's a strange ambiguity because this looks like this soldier is falling backwards. He's not seated, but he's not standing. And it looks like as the procession comes nearer to him, he's actually sort of being thrown back. We have this city back here on this hillside, and that's, of course, supposed to stand in for the city of Jerusalem. But, of course, it has very little to do with Jerusalem in terms of any historical accuracy. From the Christ carrying the cross, we come to Benvenuto's scene of the crucifixion. And here again, much like in the Andrea di Vanni, we have a number of similarities, but some differences. Andrea di Vanni showed us the two thieves, and Benvenuto does not. He does show us Mary swooning again. He does show us the casting of lots here for the raiment. He shows Longinus here. But there are some interesting elements here, and one pertains to this girl and these two other children who she's hugging this tree. She's holding on to this tree. She's not climbing that tree to get a view of anything. She's actually holding on to the tree. And what it appears to be is that she feels the earth, there's some kind of tremor. In other words, with the crucifixion and with Jesus' death, there is this massive earthquake and trembling of the earth. And it appears that what Benvenuto is trying to say is that she perhaps already senses this, and that's reinforced by the horse and rider over here on the far right, which seems now to be very skittish. And the rider is trying to control that horse as if he, an animal, also senses what is about to take place. When we come to the figure of Longinus, now he's interesting in many ways because in the canonical Gospels, there's no mention of him. There's a mention of a centurion, but no name is given in any of the canonical Gospels. But where that comes from, that it is Longinus, that's the man's name, comes from an apocryphal gospel, and that's the Gospel of Nicodemus. The story of Easter is drawn from many sources. Certainly the four canonical Gospels are important, apocryphal Gospels that the artists certainly were aware of, the writings of saints. All of these things contribute to the way these stories are told over time. So in the Gospel of Nicodemus, he is mentioned, the centurion is mentioned by name. The other thing that's not mentioned in the canonical Gospels are the names of the two thieves. Nowhere in the four canonical Gospels are they given names, but in the Gospel of Nicodemus they are named. One is named Demas and the other one is named Justus. So one of the things that is important about the centurion is that the centurion goes through a conversion. So in Matthew 27:54 is this passage. Now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." That's going to be very important in another crucifixion that I'll show you a little bit later. That's going to be very important to Lutherans and to the understanding of Martin Luther's core principle that all one needs is faith alone to be saved, because the centurion represents that concept. He didn't study catechism or anything. He has an immediate conversion based on faith alone. And so he will become very important in Protestant images of the crucifixion, and especially those that are strongly tied to Martin Luther. Now, the casting of lots. Again, that's in Scripture, and it's in John, and here's what it says. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. They said therefore among themselves, "Let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which saith, They parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things therefore the soldiers did." So that's an often represented part of the crucifixion, as we have here. Now we come to the other two parts of the predella. Here, Christ in limbo on the left, and then the resurrection on the right. So we're getting a little ahead of the story. Now, let's just mention this theme of limbo. Limbo is a distinctly Catholic doctrine, and it is the idea that Christ descends into hell, into limbo after his death, to pull out all of those people who were worthy of being saved and who, of course, couldn't be redeemed by Jesus because they lived before him. So what we normally see is Jesus entering this sort of, often it looks like the mouth of hell, to pull out these people. And among the people he pulls out are Adam, by this time Adam's pretty old, and Eve, John the Baptist back here. This figure in yellow, art historians debate about whether it's perhaps Moses or King David. And then we have a huge debate about who else is back here. But those characters that I've mentioned are pretty much accepted. Now, without getting theological here, I'm not a priest or a theologian, but in 2007, Pope Benedict, at that time he was the Pope, he redefined this concept of limbo. And in essence, what he did in an edict that he issued in April of 2007 is he simply diminished the importance of the concept of limbo. He pushed it off to a sort of to the side because it had been among Catholic theologians a point of debate. Who was saved, who wasn't saved, this kind of thing. So now it's become sort of a secondary issue. But in the history of art, it's often represented. So here are three versions of the same story. This is the one we just saw, Andrea di Vanni, where Christ is descending into limbo to pull out the worthy. This is the one we just looked at, Benvenuto di Giovanni, and this is Albrecht Dürer from the Small Passion, his version. So these are three images of this concept of limbo. If you look at the Andrea di Vanni, he's pulling, this is Adam again, Eve is back here. This is definitely King David, because he has a psalter in his hand. This is John the Baptist. And notice, of course, in both cases, when he enters hell, this big door drops and smashes the devil, just flattens him like a pancake here and here. And here, of course, Jesus is so radiant, he's actually glowing when you look at this, that he's casting such a bright light that figures who are being saved are actually shielding their eyes. They're trying not to look directly because of his brilliance and of his radiance here. So these are three sort of standard portrayals of this concept. Now, as we move along, we come to, after the trial, the events that are leading ultimately to the crucifixion. And so here's the mocking of Christ by Dürer. One of the other stops along the way, remember, in terms of judgments. There's Annas, there's Caiaphas, there's Herod, but here's the one of Pilate on the right, Christ before Pilate. Here is Christ before Herod on the left. And then ultimately the immediate scourging, flagellation, and all of the events that lead to the crucifixion. So on the right is the flagellation of Christ from the Albrecht Dürer portfolio. He goes through this tortuous sort of pre-crucifixion ritual. He's crowned with thorns here on the left, Christ crowned with thorns. After all of this, he's presented to the crowd by Pilate, and this is the famous Ecce Homo, behold the man, and that's what you see on the right. Now, in terms of what images we have at the gallery that pertain to some of these events, we have a very interesting one that pertains to the flagellation. It's this one here, and this is by a Florentine artist named Bacchiacca. It's the flagellation of Christ from about 1512. And this is a beautiful illustration of the fact that very often artists, they may be attracted to a story because of the story, and that's certainly the case with the Passion. Certainly specific moments like the denial of Peter is a very potent attraction. But sometimes they're attracted to the story not so much for the story, but for what it will allow them to show us in terms of their artistic skill. In other words, the story is just a pretext for showing us something. That's what's going on here. Here we have Christ bound at the column, and he's being scourged by these two flagellators here, left and right. But immediately when you look at this painting, that whole story is really not prominent, because what you get caught up with more than anything is just looking at those bodies. And of course, that's what Bacchiacca wants. He wants you to look at these bodies and say, wow, this guy really knows anatomy. And he's showing it to you even to the point where he shows you this figure from the front, and then he flips him over and shows him from the back. This verso recto view, that's conscious on his part to show you, look, I know the body from the front, I know the body from the back. Not only that, not only have I studied anatomy, but I understand perfect scientific one-point linear perspective. So he sets off this courtyard, which has perfect perspective, single vanishing point. I don't just know scientific linear perspective, I know atmospheric perspective, how things get hazier off into the distance. Not only that, but I know classical architecture. I have studied Greek and Roman architecture. This is a kind of resume. And what kind of gets lost is the actual story. So the gruesomeness and the tragedy and the pathos is really kind of not present. Christ's body is totally unmarked here. And then when you look at little details, for example, what's the story with these hats? They're very decorative, if not foppish, with these feathers. And then you find these loincloths. Look at this one here. It tails all the way down like a ribbon. And of course, as soon as you see something like that, you just look at that and you say, gee, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful kind of linear rhythm. And so the story gets vitiated. The gruesomeness, the pathos of the scriptural source is sort of lost. This is something Italians are, especially at this time in the 15th and 16th century, they want to show you that they are at the cutting edge of understanding the most modern ideas about painting. Now, we have one of the most beautiful sculptures at the National Gallery that, again, I think many people sort of fail to see or find because it's downstairs in the sculpture galleries and it's not big. It's about 16 inches maybe tall, but it's this figure which relates to the flagellation. This is the Christ bound from 1620s. It's ivory. It's an ivory carving. It's by Flemish artist, sculptor, Francois Duquesnoy. And this is an exquisite, absolutely exquisite sculpture. And it's carved from ivory. Ivory was a very precious commodity. It came from the East, from Turkey, the Ottoman Turk Empire. It was reserved for only the most exclusive clients. And of course, we're talking about ivory from elephant tusks. That would have been the source for this. So almost always when you see a sculpture of this period that's in ivory, it's going to have a curve to it. That is the curve of the tusk. So the sculptor has to look at this curve and figure, okay, how can I get a figure out of that? Sometimes he can't, or sometimes he can only get a part of it, and then he has to attach other things. I'll show you that in a second. But here it's from a single tusk that's been carved. And I'm just showing you three views, front, back, and sort of side view here. This is just absolutely jaw-droppingly beautiful. The detail of the carving, ivory can have almost a translucent kind of quality. Light almost seems to penetrate it when you look at it. The detail of the face, etc. This has the same idea of perfection of the body that we just saw with Bacchiacca. And there is an aspect of that that relates to a more symbolic concept, and that is that the physical perfection of Christ's body relates to his sanctity. So there is that equation that is often kind of in play when we see these beautifully idealized bodies of Christ, even in a flagellation scene. But this is a sculpture to seek out if you haven't already found it in the collection. Now, along the same line are these two sculptures by an Italian named Alessandro Algardi. He was a sculptor in the time of Bernini, and he was one of the few who could sort of step out from the shadow of Bernini, who had cast such a huge shadow in terms of his talent. And so we have on the left the flagellator of Christ. So it relates directly back to this, but they're in sculpture now. So you would have three figures normally. So we have one of the flagellators here, 1630, and then we have Christ at the column on the right. Now, these were acquired by the gallery separately at different times. And the hope was that maybe these did go together, and we're just missing the third figure. And when our lab analyzed the metal alloys of these two figures, they are exactly the same. So there's a very good chance that these two did go together, and that we're just missing the third figure that might show up someday. These are silver, not bronze. Again, beautiful detail. They're not very big, again, about, 16 inches maybe not even that. Here, going back to Dürr, we have another important scene. This is when Pilate is washing his hands. He's not going to be responsible for what happens on the left. And then, of course, Christ is made to carry the cross. Now, we saw that in the Benvenuto di Giovanni painting. Very often in the Dürr, there's such congestion and so many figures that you have to kind of look carefully because Christ is down here. Now, here's an interesting painting from the gallery. This is Christ carrying the cross, same subject. It's by a Dutch painter, and it's from the 1620s. And it's a painting on copper, and it's by the artist Cornelius van Polenburg. He was very well known in his time, and he lived in the late 16th, early 17th century. But here's another, somewhat like what I was describing with the flagellation scene, where you had an artist who was less interested in the story and more interested in showing us something else. In this case, it's the same. This procession, here's Longinus, here's Christ carrying the cross, Mary Magdalene, Mary, everybody's back here, Joseph of Arimathea, etc. They're all in this procession. But they're almost a sort of afterthought. They're small, they're embedded into a larger landscape. And this is definitely not Jerusalem or the Middle East. This is Rome. This is the countryside of Rome, to the extent that the ruin that you're looking at on the right is the tomb of Cecilia Metella, which is on the Appian Way in Rome. So here, if you were to take out the figures, you would have an ideal landscape that was very popular at this time, showing the Roman countryside with a Roman ruin. This would be worthy of artists like Hubert Robert later, Panini, certainly earlier Poussin, Claude Lorrain. So here again, the artist is not being motivated so much by the story, but he's looking for an excuse to show this landscape. And that's really the dominant sort of idea that he's trying to deal with. By the way, even the support, the way this painting is more horizontal than vertical. In most scenes of Christ carrying the cross, they focus right in on Christ carrying the cross, and it's very often a vertical support, not a horizontal painting. And this painting is much more horizontal than it is vertical. Then the nailing of Christ to the cross on the left in the Dürr, and the crucifixion on the right. Now, I've already gone through some of the subsidiary elements that almost always crop up in a crucifixion scene: casting of lots, the two thieves, the piercing of the side, all of that. But let's talk a little more about some other elements that relate to the crucifixion. Here's our painting of the crucifixion by Paolo Veneziano. He's obviously, as his name implies, he's a Venetian painter. This dates to around 1340. He's one of the most prominent painters in Venice in the 14th century. He shows us his idea of Jerusalem, which is this green crenellated wall here. He shows us the weeping figures of the angels here. Adam's skull down here. This is Golgotha, the land of skulls, the place of skulls. Almost all of those motifs are Byzantine. Paolo Veneziano at this point in time in the 1300s is very indebted to the Byzantine tradition. It's very active in Venice. Venice is a city that had a very Eastern kind of orientation to it. But then we find something that I pointed out in the two of the previous crucifixions, and it's again here. And this is the swooning of Mary, or the fainting of Mary. So here are three details from the paintings we've seen. This is the Veneziano I just showed you. This is Benvenuto di Giovanni, and this is Andrea di Vanni, so I've shown you. And here we see in each crucifixion we have Mary swooning or fainting out of grief. Now, what's going on with that? Well, this is actually referred to specifically in Italian by lo spasimo della Vergine, the faint or the swoon of the Virgin. And this idea that the Virgin swooned or fainted at the crucifixion when her son was on the cross is a concept that comes about in the late Middle Ages. It's a motif or a concept that comes about in the late Middle Ages, and it lasts till about maybe the 16th century. So paintings in this period from about 1300 to 1500 almost always show Mary swooning at the cross. Now, is that in the Gospels? No, it is not. It is nowhere in the canonical Gospels that she swooned or fainted. So where does that come from? We're back to what I mentioned earlier, the Gospel of Nicodemus. In that apocryphal gospel, Mary does in fact swoon. It's the section known as the Acts of Pilate. So this found favor in this particular period, but then by the 16th century, because it wasn't canonical, there was a reassessment of whether this was appropriate to have in a picture, and so you begin to see it sort of fall by the wayside. But for a period of time, it's particularly prominent. So in the Gospel of Nicodemus, we read this. This is part 1, the Acts of Pilate, chapter 10. When, therefore, they came to the multitude of the crowd, the mother of God says to John, "Where is my son?" John says, "Seest thou him bearing the crown of thorns and having his hands bound?" And the mother of God, hearing this and seeing him, fainted and fell backwards to the ground and lay a considerable time. And the women, as many as followed her, stood round her and wept. So that's the actual source in the Gospel of Nicodemus that artists were referring to. But there is no reference to that in the canonical Gospel. Now, here is a detail of the crucifixion by Perugino, where we see Jesus on the cross, Mary to the left and John to the right. What we have in the canonical gospel in John is the reference to the fact that Mary stood. John says that very clearly. Mary stood by the cross. Now that concept gets translated, Mary's grief, standing by the cross, does get translated into a very important form of music. It's what's called a Stabat Mater in Latin. This is a particular type of musical composition, and the first line of a Stabat Mater in terms of the text is Stabat Mater Dolorosa, which means the sorrowful mother was standing. Stabat Mater Dolorosa. Now, almost every great composer wrote a Stabat Mater. If you go through the history of Western music, Palestrina, Vivaldi, both Scarlattis, Pergolesi, Haydn, Tartini, Rossini, Dvorak, Verdi, Szymanowski, Poulenc, Arvo Pärt, everybody wrote a Stabat Mater. I'm not going to read you the whole text. We think this text was written in the 13th century by a Franciscan, a monk named Jacopone da Todi, but we're not sure about who might have written this. But the first couple of verses say this: "At the cross, her station keeping, stood the mournful mother weeping, close to her son to the last. Through her heart, his sorrow sharing, all his bitter anguish bearing, now at length the sword has passed. Oh, how sad and sore distressed was that mother, highly blessed, of the sole begotten one. Christ above in torment hangs, she beneath beholds the pangs of her dying glorious son. Is there one who would not weep, whelmed in misery so deep, Christ's dear mother to behold?" So it goes on much longer than that, but that's just the opening that establishes this idea of Mary standing by the cross, as we see here in the Perugino, going through her grief for the death of her son. Now, here's the whole painting. And this is by Perugino. This is the crucifixion with the Virgin, St. John, St. Jerome, and Mary Magdalene. It dates to 1482. This is a painting in the room that we have devoted more or less to Raphael, because Perugino was Raphael's teacher. So that's where you'll find this painting. Now, I haven't mentioned another moment at the crucifixion, and that's probably what is relevant here to Perugino. First of all, this, unlike what I've just been showing you, all the other crucifixions, which seem to be very anecdotal, narrative-driven, clearly this is not. And that is because this is a painting that is meant to be a point of meditation, contemplation. Perugino is not interested really in telling us the story and showing us all the details and what might have been happening, the casting of lots and all of that other stuff. This is a peaceful painting. It's an idealized painting. There's no sign of all the torture that Jesus has been through before he's even placed on the cross. It's a beautiful, idyllic landscape, beautiful atmospheric perspective. Again, Perugino creates these beautiful triangular compositions, very stable. Everything about the painting is contemplative, meditative. This would be the kind of painting that somebody would kneel in front of and pray and go through some kind of meditation. So those more specific narrative aspects are somewhat diminished here. But there is something that's important here, and that is Jesus hanging on the cross. If you look carefully, it's hard to see where you're seated. His eyes are open. He's not dead. And so that in itself is significant because that is the idea of Christ's triumph over death, so as a contemplative idea. But he's looking down towards his mother. And so here we have another moment in the crucifixion that is often represented. And this is the moment in John 19:25-27, where we read, "Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home." This is the moment when Jesus is on the cross. He looks down and sees John, his most beloved disciple, and his mother Mary, and he speaks to both of them, in essence, to tell them that, Mother, this is going to be your son now, and telling John, this is going to be your mother, and take care of her. So he's entrusting his mother to John. And that really is what's part of the meaning or understanding of this portrayal here. Here are the side panels that show St. Jerome and Mary Magdalene. Now you look at this picture of the crucifixion, the peace and the beauty and the serenity, nothing of the garishness and gruesomeness of its crucifixion, the pain, the suffering, the pathos, none of that is present here. And then you look at this. We're in a different place now. This is the great crucifixion by the German artist Matthias Grunewald. This is known as the Small Crucifixion from 1511. This is one of the most important paintings we have at the National Gallery. We have only 20 extant paintings by Matthias Grunewald, and there's only one in the United States, and it's this one here. So Grunewald is a contemporary of Dürer, so we've been looking at the Dürer print series, and Albrecht Dürer and Matthias Grunewald are exact contemporaries, but they're very different. Grunewald was much more tied to his own local Gothic traditions, the earlier history of German art, and Dürer had an eye for Italy and had an interest in classical imagery and sources. So in Grunewald, we see all of the horror and all of the pathos and all of the suffering of what a crucifixion would be about. So here Christ hangs on the cross. The very weight of the body is caving in his chest cavity. The weight of the body seems to actually be pulling down on the crossbeam of the cross. This body is totally ravaged. It's been ravaged by being scourged. Roman scourges at the end of the leather sort of strip were usually pieces of glass or wood, so that when you were scourged, the wood or the glass would open up the body, the skin, and it would create almost a furrow. And sometimes these pieces of wood or glass would get embedded into the skin of the person being scourged. That's all here in the Grunewald. We see Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene, John here. This is nocturnal. It's not what we just saw in Perugino, that beautiful idealized landscape. It's nocturnal, and in fact, if you look up here, right here in the upper right, there is a total eclipse of the sun. It's a solar eclipse. Now here, clearly Grunwald is referring to the passage in Luke where it says, "And there was a darkness over all the earth." So day is turned to night. As Jesus dies on the cross, day is turned to night, and that is shown here as a solar eclipse. And what's interesting is that we know in Germany on October 1st, well, let me put it this way, on October 1st, 1502, there was a complete solar eclipse in Europe that could be seen from Germany. So Grunwald probably actually saw this transformation of day into night, literally, during a solar eclipse. Now, this is the small crucifixion, that so-called. The reason we call this the small crucifixion is because it relates to Grunwald's most famous picture, which is this. This is the Isenheim altarpiece. That's in Colmar in France today. It's in the Unterlinden Museum. This is a gigantic altarpiece. You can see people down here, so you can see the scale. It opens many times. It keeps opening and opening. Some of the panels have been removed and placed back here. When it's closed, which is what you see here, when it's closed, the main subject on the front of the altarpiece is the crucifixion. And this is much larger than our crucifixion, but clearly they sort of go together. Now, this was a work that was created for the Antonine order founded by St. Anthony. And what the Antonine order, what their mission was, what they did was to take care of people who had incurable diseases. So this painting was actually not meant for a church, it was meant for a hospital. And the idea, and in fact it was placed right in the areas where going down the walls, you would have had everybody in their beds. So as gruesome as this is, the idea was that if I'm suffering from a various incurable disease, I look at this painting and I realize that no matter how badly I'm suffering, Christ suffered more for our sins. The particular disease that is actually associated with St. Anthony came to be known as St. Anthony's fire. And this was an incurable disease that came from eating tainted wheat and rye products. It's called ergotism is the name of the disease. It was a horrific disease, and it led to all kinds of painful skin rashes and conditions, and very often it actually led to amputation. And when you look at the altarpiece here, one of the things here, first of all, let's look at some details. So here are some of the details. Now, this couldn't be more different than Perugino. Every scar and scab and scrape and movement and effort and result of the scourging is present here. Parts of the scourge are still sticking in the body. Here, the weight on the shoulders, the collapse of the chest, the crowning of thorns, the splaying of the hands where the nails have gone through. Same situation with the feet. Now, this is gruesome. There's no question about it. Here is when it's closed. One of the interesting things about the way Grunwald painted this in terms of its opening and closing, this is the seam where it opens. You notice this? And when you open this, and it relates to the predella that's in the bottom, when you open this, it severs this limb. It looks like that limb has been amputated. And in the predella, down here, where this opens, it severs the legs. So you have this amputation when the altarpiece opens, which seems to reflect the amputations of so many of these suffering people. So let's stay here for a moment. Where and how, I mean, the scriptural accounts of the crucifixion are direct, but they're not really horrific, shall we say. They don't really go into this kind of gross, very, very almost difficult to look at kind of effect. So where might that have come from? Well, probably the source here is not scriptural. It's not the canonical Gospels. It's not the apocryphal Gospels, but it's a writing of saints, but most especially one particular saint. She's very relevant in the Christmas story, but she's equally relevant here, and that's Saint Bridget of Sweden. Saint Bridget lives from around 1303 to 1373. She is a mystic saint. She has revelations, visions. She collects these. Ultimately, they're published first in Latin, but then they're translated. They're widely disseminated throughout Europe. And one of her revelations is about the crucifixion. It's in Book 4, Chapter 70. It's called A Vision of the Crucifixion. And in this, what she's actually telling us is that she's talking to the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary is telling her what it was like to be present at the death of her son and what he looked like and how he suffered. And so in part, this is what Bridget writes, again speaking as if it's the Virgin Mary. He was bound with a rope and then scourged with barbed whips. The barbs caught in his skin and were then pulled backward, not just tearing, but plowing into him so as to wound his whole body. On being ordered, he lay down with his back to the cross, and when he was asked to do so, first stretched out his right hand. Then, since his left hand could not reach the other corner of the cross, it had to be stretched out at full length. His feet were similarly stretched out to reach the slots for the nails and placed crosswise, and, as if they had been loosened from the shin bones, were fastened to the wood of the cross by 2 nails driven through solid bone, as had been done with his hands. Now the color of death appeared in those parts of his body that were visible beneath the blood. His cheeks cleaved to his teeth. You could count his thin, naked ribs. His stomach, emptied now of all its juices, was sucked in toward his back, and even his nostrils looked thin now. When his heart was near to breaking, his whole body shook, and his beard fell toward his chest. Right then, I collapsed lifeless to the ground. Though the others were going away, I could not go away. I felt almost comforted to be able to touch the body when it was taken down from the cross, and take it in my arms, and explore his wounds, and wipe away the blood. I closed his mouth with my fingers, and shut his eyes as well. Now that's pretty gory and direct, and this description in St. Bridget had a wide currency, and especially in Northern Europe, you see, I think, Grunwald responding to that in his own way. It's also interesting, if you recall in this passage, she mentions also that Mary swoons. That's something St. Bridget says as well. And then she mentions something else at the end, which is is not in the canonical Gospels, that she, after he comes down from the cross, she takes his body, grieves over it, what we call a pietà. There's no source in the canonical Gospels for that moment. So we're going to come back to that in a second. So here's the difference between Perugino, certainly, and Grunwald. I think it sort of speaks for itself. Now we come to another crucifixion that's very important in our collection, and this is by Lucas Cranach, the Elder. And I've already sort of alluded to one of the motifs in this that's very important. This title of this crucifixion is The Crucifixion with the Converted Centurion from 1536. Cranach is the court painter to the electors of Saxony in Wittenberg, but he is incredibly close to Martin Luther. They are close friends almost from childhood. When Luther needed to publish his pamphlets and print his pamphlets, he used the printing press of Lucas Cranach. Cranach was godfather to one of Luther's children. So they were very, very close. And Cranach is clearly an artist who was affected by the writings of Luther and who converted to Lutheranism. So here we have the crucifixion with the converted centurion. And as I've already alluded, the centurion became an important motif in Protestant and in Lutheran imagery because he seemed to symbolize and represent the idea that was so pivotal to Luther's teachings of faith alone. You just need faith to be saved. And because the centurion had this sort of immediate recognition of the importance of Jesus when he says, truly, this man was the Son of God. He has that moment of revelation. But the other thing that's important here is what you can see here, but you can't see it closely enough, but I'll tell you what it is. You have 2 inscriptions, and these are the words that are being spoken down below by the centurion. And what the centurion is saying is what we always associate with him. He's saying, truly, this man was the Son of God. But what's important about this? It's written in German. And up here, we have another inscription above the head of Jesus, and that is the inscription. These, of course, come from both Matthew and Luke. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. This is in German as well. Now, what's important about that is that Luther had translated the Bible in 1522 from Latin into German. And for Luther, it was important to have the Bible now in the vernacular where everybody could read it for themselves. You don't have to have a priest interpret it for you. By translating the New Testament into German, he accomplished that. And Cranach is essentially reinforcing that. He's not using Latin inscriptions here. He's using German. So anybody looking at this would certainly recognize and understand what's being said. We have a couple of beautiful crucifixes in our sculpture collection. This is the Pistoia crucifix on the left by a Florentine sculptor, Pietro Tacca, T-A-C-C-A, from about 1600. It's one of the most beautiful crucifixes by Tacca. He produced a number of these works. He's an incredibly skilled silversmith and bronze caster. This is a bronze here. But in many ways, the more interesting work is the one on the right. And this is not Italian. It's German, probably. We're not sure. We think it's German, and we think it's probably at the start of the 18th century, maybe right around 1700. There's been no attribution. We can't come up with an artist for this, so at the moment it's still something that we're pursuing research on. It's an ivory. It's an ivory carving. We saw the Duquesnoy a little while ago. And this is, again, like the Duquesnoy, this is just really a spectacular piece. It's interesting here because, again, using what would have been an elephant tusk. In this case, the tusk was probably this from the toes up to the head, but not the arms, because the arms were attached separately. So when you look at this, you see that the arms are attached separately. But it's the detail of this crucifix that seems to almost mirror the Grunwald, because there's tremendous pathos and pain, suffering. The hair is wild. It looks almost like it's blowing in a storm, the same with the loincloth. So many people think that this is a sort of echo of that same moment. If we think again in the Gospel of St. Matthew, but also in Luke, where we read, "From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened." So passages like that speak to a cyclonic earthquake and wind seems maybe to be relevant to the way that this particular figure of Christ is portrayed on the cross here. Once its permission is granted to take Jesus from the cross, then we have a series of images that come into play, a series of moments in the Passion. On the left is Dur's The Descent from the Cross. And on the right is what we can call either a lamentation or a pietà, where Mary is mourning the body of Jesus. Now, as I just mentioned to you, there is no scriptural source for the fact that when Jesus' body is taken down, there's some moment when Mary cradles the body of her son and then grieves over it. That's in St. Bridget, her Revelations, but it's not in the canonical Gospels. But nonetheless, this becomes a very oft represented subject. So let's take it one at a time. First, the body has to come off the cross. So here is a painting in our collection on the left. This is a painting from a Rembrandt workshop. It's not a Rembrandt. Many, many years ago, there was some thought that it was, but it's not. It's certainly somebody in his circle. It's The Descent from the Cross from around 1650. Painting on the right is a Rembrandt. This is in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, The Descent from the Cross from 1632 to 33. So taking the body off of the cross is what we have as this next moment. And then when the body does come down, We now encounter a subject that, as I said, doesn't have any scriptural source, but it becomes very much very popular subject. We can call it a lamentation or a pietà. And here is the painting we have at the gallery, which is by Andrea Solario. It's called Lamentation, 1505. So a lamentation is synonymous more or less with a pietà, and the terms are almost used interchangeably. If you have a descent from the cross, you should have a cross from which he's descending. So that's, again, sometimes this iconography gets kind of jumbled. And then the next element, or the next moment, is a deposition or an entombment, which means that's putting Jesus into the tomb, in which case you should have a tomb. And what I'm saying this for is because sometimes you're not sure, are we looking at a pietà, an entombment, deposition? Sometimes these things get a little blurry in terms of their boundaries. But what we have with the Andrea Solario here is clearly a pietà or a lamentation, where Mary grieves the body of her son, Mary Magdalene, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, they're all here, John here. In sculpture, we have the sculpture by Giovanni della Robbia, Pietà, from 1510. And then we have this work on the right. It's an anonymous work, but it's certainly Netherlandish, 15th century Netherlands, a Pietà. That's carved from alabaster on the right. This is glazed terracotta. Here on the left, we did a big della Robbia show not too long ago. Now, here's the problem right here. One of the problems, artistically speaking, formally speaking, in a Pietà has always been, how do I have the smaller body of a woman hold the larger body of a man and make it look somewhat stable and cohesive? I would say Giovanni fails here, because he just says, forget it. The legs are going to just dangle. And the head breaks back, and she is trying to hold the head, but she's almost moving forward. It almost looks like he's going to slide off her lap right into our space. So one way, okay, let's not have her hold him. Let's have him more on the ground. So that's what we had back here. That's okay. And that's sort of what we have on the right. Christ's body is more on the ground than it is being supported by Mary. But there have been different solutions to this. This is the great Perugino painting at the Uffizi in Florence on the left, Pietà from 1483. And then that's Michelangelo's Pietà on the right. That's in St. Peter's in the Vatican from 1498. Now, in the case of Perugino, this was a very common solution to this problem, which is simply, let's bring in help. So let's have Mary just support the central part of the body. Mary Magdalene can hold the feet. John can hold the upper torso. Now, Michelangelo grew up with this painting. He knew it intimately, and he thought this was silly. In his case, it was, I want something beautifully cohesive that is a beautiful sort of pyramidal form. So he changed, he solved the problem differently. He has Mary holding the body of Jesus, but he wraps the body up to the shoulder in this movement here. And then, of course, he encases Mary in this incredible voluminous drapery so that she looks more supportive. So this has been one of the sort of ways in which artists have dealt with the Pietà. You'll see lots of different solutions. For example, two of our paintings, Jacopo Palma, Il Giovane on the left, this is a lamentation. On the right is a painting from the circle of Tintoretto. It's not Tintoretto, but it's certainly somebody in his circle. A lamentation. Sometimes the body goes vertically, but you still need a lot of people, Mary, John, Nicodemus, and everybody here to kind of help out. Sometimes, again, you got a whole group, again, that are trying to support the body. Ultimately, we come to the entombment when Christ's body is then placed in the tomb. So here is Durer on the left. An entombment can also be called a deposition. You're depositing the body into the tomb. This is Durer on the left. Durer's great rival as a printmaker was Martin Schongauer. On the right, his entombment from 1480. Now, the burial of Jesus, the entombment, is discussed and mentioned in all of the Gospels, and in John it says this: "And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. And there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand." So they used this tomb that's been carved but had never been used yet, and that's where Jesus' body is placed. But then what do you do with things like this, where it seems like it's both a pietà and both an entombment? And so in the case of the Filippino Lippi painting on the left, which is in our collection, it is a pietà, but clearly you see the tomb here. And this is Nicodemus, who's supporting the body with these two angels. And on the right, another sort of version of the story is by Muretto da Brescia, a northern painter in Italy. This is his Pietà from the 1520s. These are all in our collections. And then ultimately, we bring the story to a kind of conclusion with the resurrection. Now, again, obviously, this is in all four canonical Gospels. I'm just going to read you just this section in Matthew. "In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him the keepers did shake, and became as dead men. And the angel answered and said unto the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, which was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him. Lo, I have told you." So that's the discussion in Matthew. So we have, again, different interpretations of the resurrection by artists. In this case, this is a painting we have in our collection by Bergognone. He's a northern painter in Italy, Christ Risen from the Tomb, from about 1490. This is a standard motif where Jesus seems to be walking out of the tomb, putting his leg up on the ledge, and he's about to come out. And what that probably relates to, that motif, is classical art, specifically images of classical generals and warriors standing over the vanquished bodies of people they've defeated in combat, where they have their foot on the head of somebody that they vanquished. So this is an example of where a classical motif was Christianized, you might say, to work for the resurrection. Durer, on the right, his resurrection, is more straightforward in terms of its emerging from the tomb. These are the two self-portraits in the exhibition. The young self-portrait on the left of Tintoretto from 1546, and a late self-portrait from 1588. But in reference to the subjects we've been looking at, the Passion, there are at least three very important paintings in the Tintoretto show. Here is Tintoretto's Last Supper. That's in the exhibition from 1563. And here you can see what I was alluding to earlier, how it's a very kind of chaotic scene. Chairs are being tipped over. You're not quite sure what's actually happening, if it's just a tavern scene or if it's actually the Last Supper. Of course, the difference is the scale here is quite large, much larger than the Sebastiano Ricci painting that I mentioned to you. And then these two paintings are in the show. The Deposition of Christ by Tintoretto from 1562 comes from the Accademia in Venice. And then the Entombment of Christ on the right from 1594 comes from San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. Thanks for your patience. Thank you very much.